I stayed silent at work, but every laugh, every whisper behind my back, every snide comment, I recorded it all. And when the time came, the people who thought they could humiliate me without consequences would finally learn just how wrong they were. What happened next changed everything. I thought I knew what silence meant. To keep my head down, to smile when I wanted to scream, to nod politely when my blood boiled, these were survival tactics I had perfected. But nothing could have prepared me for Rachel. Rachel was our boss, and from the moment I first met her, I sensed a darkness in her smile. Not the kind of darkness that lurks quietly in the shadows, but one that actively seeks out a victim, feeds off fear, and thrives on control. I was new at the firm, eager but cautious. And apparently, that made me an easy target. The first incident happened on my second week. I was organizing client files at my desk when she walked by, her heels clacking like a warning siren. Without looking at me, she said, "Do you ever sleep, or do you just sit there looking like a confused little mouse?" There was laughter. Just a ripple at first, subtle, from a few colleagues nearby. I froze. My hands gripped the folder a little too tightly. My heart pounded. I wanted to respond. I wanted to explain that I was doing my job, that I had a system, that, anything. But I stayed silent. I told myself it was better this way. Reacting would only give them ammunition. I smiled faintly, pretending not to notice the sting in her words, and went back to my filing. But that was only the beginning. Over the following months, Rachel's verbal attacks escalated. Sometimes they were personal, cutting deep into areas I thought were private. My hair. My clothes. The way I walked. My relationships. She seemed to enjoy pointing out the smallest imperfections, making them into daily performances for everyone else to witness. And my colleagues weren't innocent. Sarah and Alex, who I had once considered friendly, quickly revealed themselves as loyal sidekicks to Rachel's cruelty. They would mock my lunch choices, whisper jokes about my hair, and even comment on personal conversations I'd had with friends outside the office. Every day felt like a new layer of torment. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just joking. Maybe it was part of the office culture. Maybe, if I ignored it long enough, it would stop. It didn't. Every morning, I would wake up with a knot in my stomach. I would rehearse conversations in my head, preparing for the next day's humiliation. And every night, I would cry silently in my apartment, hating the person I had become at work, quiet, anxious, and invisible. But here's what I realized slowly, almost too late: staying silent didn't mean giving up. It meant surviving, and planning. I began keeping track, discreetly, of every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every time I was humiliated. My phone became a secret recorder. My notebooks filled with tiny notes, time-stamped and detailed. I cataloged the moments Rachel mocked me in front of clients, the times Sarah and Alex whispered insults from across the office, the little betrayals that seemed insignificant in the moment but formed a chain of toxic abuse. I stayed silent outwardly, but inwardly, I was gathering ammunition. I became meticulous. I learned how to smile just enough to avoid suspicion. I memorized the office dynamics so I could anticipate attacks. And slowly, I transformed from a target into a patient observer, silently counting the days until I could strike back. Then came the day I dreaded the most. Rachel called me into her office. The door clicked behind me, and I tried to mask the panic rising in my chest. "It's not working out," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You're just not a good fit for the company culture." I was stunned. My world shrank into that phrase. All the effort, all the late nights, all the patience, dismissed with a few words. I packed my things quietly. Every step out of that office felt heavy, as though the air itself had grown thicker. My colleagues avoided my gaze, whispering behind closed doors, perhaps enjoying the drama they had anticipated. But I didn't feel defeated. Not really. Because I knew something they didn't. The evidence I had collected, the recordings, the notes, the meticulous documentation, was a weapon. And I intended to use it. Over the next few weeks, I prepared carefully. I filed a formal complaint with HR, presenting every snippet of abuse in painstaking detail. I reached out to a few trusted colleagues who had quietly observed the harassment and shared what I had recorded. Shock spread quickly through the office, whispered like wildfire in the corridors. The reactions were instantaneous. Rachel, who had always believed herself untouchable, was called in for a meeting with HR. Her confident smile faltered as the evidence was presented. She attempted excuses, her voice shaky, but nothing could erase the digital proof, the witness statements, or the careful logs I had maintained. Sarah and Alex were next. They were blindsided, realizing too late that the silent girl they had tormented was now the one in control. Their dismissive attitudes crumbled under scrutiny, and within days, both were removed from the company. I received a formal apology. A settlement offer. Even the chance to return to the company, this time in a position of power and respect. I declined. Because the victory wasn't in returning. It was in watching justice unfold from a distance, in knowing that silence had been my strategy, not my surrender. As I walked out of that office for the final time, the city felt different. The air felt lighter. My chest expanded with pride. I had stayed silent at work, but I had never been weak. I had never truly been silenced. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it is quiet. Patient. Waiting for the right moment to rise. The experience changed me. It sharpened my instincts, honed my patience, and gave me courage I didn't know I possessed. And it planted a seed, an understanding that I would never again allow anyone to diminish me without consequences. This was just the beginning. Because when silence is paired with careful planning, even the most toxic of people cannot escape the consequences of their actions. And soon, they would all find out exactly what that meant. After leaving Rachel's office that day, I felt an unusual calm settle over me. It wasn't relief, not exactly, it was sharper, more electric. For months, I had been collecting evidence in secret, carefully cataloging every incident of abuse. But up until that moment, it had been theoretical. Now, for the first time, I realized I held a weapon in my hands. I was no longer just the receptionist who smiled while being humiliated. I was a strategist. And strategy requires patience. The next morning, I walked through the office as if nothing had happened. My colleagues were whispering, casting curious glances at the empty space behind my desk. They didn't know what I was planning, and that ignorance made their fear more delicious. Rachel, of course, had no idea what was coming. She strutted past my desk, flipping through files, tossing a glance in my direction as if to say, "You can't touch me." I returned her gaze with perfect neutrality, a slight smile that didn't reach my eyes. Inside, I was calculating. I reviewed my recordings from the previous months. Every cruel joke, every subtle threat, every humiliating comment was there. Sarah had mocked the color of my scarf at least 5 times. Alex had sneered at my handwriting on official documents. And Rachel. Rachel had perfected the art of psychological torment, alternating between fake sympathy and cutting remarks in a way that left me second-guessing myself daily. After leaving Rachel's office that day, I felt an unusual calm settle over me. It wasn't relief, not exactly, it was sharper, more electric. For months, I had been collecting evidence in secret, carefully cataloging every incident of abuse. But up until that moment, it had been theoretical. Now, for the first time, I realized I held a weapon in my hands. I was no longer just the receptionist who smiled while being humiliated. I was a strategist. And strategy requires patience. The next morning, I walked through the office as if nothing had happened. My colleagues were whispering, casting curious glances at the empty space behind my desk. They didn't know what I was planning, and that ignorance made their fear more delicious. Rachel, of course, had no idea what was coming. She strutted past my desk, flipping through files, tossing a glance in my direction as if to say, "You can't touch me." I returned her gaze with perfect neutrality, a slight smile that didn't reach my eyes. Inside, I was calculating. I reviewed my recordings from the previous months. Every cruel joke, every subtle threat, every humiliating comment was there. Sarah had mocked the color of my scarf at least 5 times. Alex had sneered at my handwriting on official documents. And Rachel. Rachel had perfected the art of psychological torment, alternating between fake sympathy and cutting remarks in a way that left me second-guessing myself daily. Now, the moment of truth was approaching, the response was immediate. HR was silent for a moment, reviewing each file, and then sent a vague acknowledgement. "We will look into this." Perfect. Just enough to make me feel that the system was listening, but not enough to alert Rachel that the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, back in the office, life continued in its chaotic, toxic rhythm. Rachel's temper flared daily, her outbursts becoming more unpredictable. She snapped at Alex for minor mistakes, humiliated Sarah in front of clients, and indirectly escalated the tension, not realizing that every one of these moments was being recorded. I observed quietly, silently, like a hawk circling overhead. I made mental notes of the dates, the times, the witnesses. Every gesture, every word, every sarcastic comment was catalogued. I didn't laugh at their jokes. I didn't react to their taunts. I let them continue thinking they had control. Then came the day when Rachel tried something new, a psychological trap that nearly rattled me. She called me into her office with an exaggeratedly warm smile. "I've heard rumors," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "that you've been speaking to HR. Is that true?" I froze for a moment. My heart pounded, but I didn't flinch. I smiled faintly. "I haven't spoken to anyone," I replied. Her lips curved into a smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Be careful. You know how quickly things can spiral in this office. It would be such a shame if people misunderstood your intentions." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I nodded politely, smiled, and walked out. Inside, I was thrilled. This was exactly what I wanted, confirmation that my recordings and observations were about to hit their mark. Rachel had just revealed her fear, and fear is the first crack in any tyrant's armor. Over the next few days, I increased my presence in subtle ways. I would ask questions that seemed innocent, but were actually pointed, making Rachel flustered and unsure. I would linger near Sarah and Alex during their gossip sessions, casually smiling as if I hadn't heard a single word they whispered about me. Every reaction, or lack of reaction, was carefully calculated. One afternoon, I finally decided it was time to escalate. I sent a carefully written email to HR, this time attaching a folder labeled Workplace Harassment Documentation. It contained every recording, every note, every witness account I had collected over months. The files were meticulous, organized by date, severity, and context. The office hummed around me, oblivious to the storm I had just unleashed. I returned to my desk and acted as though nothing had happened. I answered phones. I filed paperwork. I smiled faintly at Rachel when she passed. But inside, I was giddy. And then, the first domino fell. HR called Rachel, Sarah, and Alex into a meeting room. I watched from a distance as Rachel's confident facade faltered. She tried to speak, tried to rationalize, but the HR manager calmly laid out the evidence. Sarah and Alex were silent, their eyes widening as they realized how carefully I had documented every single humiliation. The meeting didn't last long, but the ripples were immediate. Whispers swept through the office. Colleagues who had once avoided me now approached with subtle nods of respect. Some even apologized quietly, hinting that they had noticed the abuse but had been too afraid to intervene. Rachel's behavior changed instantly. The arrogance that had once defined her was replaced by uncertainty, small flinches, and barely concealed fear. Sarah and Alex tried to regain composure, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Even though I wasn't physically present in the meeting, the impact on the office was palpable. The environment shifted. I noticed subtle glances when I walked by, a hesitancy in tone when they spoke. Their little jokes, their whispered insults, they evaporated. I had stayed silent for months, absorbing humiliation, pretending to be powerless. But the moment I chose to act, everything changed. Silence had been my shield, and patience my weapon. By the end of the week, HR had called follow-up meetings, and Rachel was put on probation. Sarah and Alex, they were removed from the office entirely. And I sat at my desk quietly, observing the aftermath, savoring the justice without saying a word. Yet, even in victory, I felt no triumph. Not yet. Because this was only the beginning. There were deeper wounds, deeper humiliations that had been inflicted upon me, moments that couldn't simply be erased by HR memos or probation. I knew I had to see this through to the very end, to make them fully understand the consequences of underestimating me. And so, I continued to watch. Carefully. Strategically. Every movement, every conversation, every interaction became part of my ongoing observation. I had tasted power, but I wanted mastery. Every day after that, as I walked through the office, I realized something crucial. They had underestimated the quiet ones. The ones who seemed powerless, submissive, or timid. Because the silent ones are always the ones planning, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. And soon, that moment would arrive. The office never felt the same after that week. Something invisible had shifted, like a crack running beneath the surface of the floor. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Laughter sounded forced, cautious. People no longer spoke freely in the break room. Everyone knew something had happened, but no one knew how far it went, or how much I still knew. And that uncertainty terrified them. Rachel tried to regain control first. She had always been a woman who thrived on dominance, on being the loudest voice in the room. But now, her authority felt hollow. She avoided eye contact with me, spoke more softly in meetings, and second-guessed herself constantly. Every time HR passed through the office, her shoulders stiffened. I noticed everything. She started documenting her own actions obsessively, sending follow-up emails, requesting confirmations, CCing unnecessary people. It was fear masquerading as professionalism. And it told me one thing very clearly: she knew she was exposed. Sarah and Alex were gone, their desks cleared out overnight. No farewell emails. No explanations. Just empty chairs and whispers. Their absence felt louder than their presence ever had. People began coming to me quietly. At first, it was subtle. A coworker would linger near my desk a little too long. Someone would ask an unnecessary question, just to stay close. Then the apologies began. I should have said something. I didn't realize how bad it was. I was scared too. I listened. I nodded. I said very little. Because listening had always been my strength. What none of them realized was that my silence was no longer defensive. It was intentional. Every confession, every admission, every nervous glance, it all painted a clearer picture of the environment Rachel had created. And it wasn't just about me. The more people talked, the more I understood that I hadn't been her only target. I was just the one who stayed long enough to document it. Rachel's paranoia grew daily. She began calling unnecessary meetings, micromanaging work that had never concerned her before. Her temper flared unpredictably, but she would catch herself halfway through an outburst and force a smile that looked painful, unnatural. Once, during a team meeting, she snapped at a junior employee for a minor mistake, then froze. Her eyes darted to me. For a split second, fear flashed across her face. She cleared her throat, apologized awkwardly, and moved on. The room was silent. That was when I realized something important. She wasn't afraid of HR anymore. She was afraid of me. And fear makes people careless. It didn't take long for her to make her next mistake. One afternoon, she pulled me aside and tried a different approach: kindness. Or at least, her version of it. "You've been doing great work lately," she said, her tone overly sweet. "I think maybe, we got off on the wrong foot earlier." earlier. As if months of humiliation were a minor misunderstanding. I'd really like us to move forward, she continued. No more tension. No more complications. I looked at her calmly. I agree, I said. Her shoulders relaxed instantly. That was her mistake. Because what she didn't know was that HR had already escalated. And my colleagues weren't innocent. Sarah and Alex, who I had once considered friendly, quickly revealed themselves as loyal sidekicks to Rachel's cruelty. They would mock my lunch choices, whisper jokes about my hair, and even comment on personal conversations I'd had with friends outside the office. Every day felt like a new layer of torment. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just joking. Maybe it was part of the office culture. Maybe, if I ignored it long enough, it would stop. It didn't. Every morning, I would wake up with a knot in my stomach. I would rehearse conversations in my head, preparing for the next day's humiliation. And every night, I would cry silently in my apartment, hating the person I had become at work, quiet, anxious, and invisible. But here's what I realized slowly, almost too late: staying silent didn't mean giving up. It meant surviving, and planning. I began keeping track, discreetly, of every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every time I was humiliated. My phone became a secret recorder. My notebooks filled with tiny notes, time-stamped and detailed. I cataloged the moments Rachel mocked me in front of clients, the times Sarah and Alex whispered insults from across the office, the little betrayals that seemed insignificant in the moment but formed a chain of toxic abuse. I stayed silent outwardly, but inwardly, I was gathering ammunition. I became meticulous. I learned how to smile just enough to avoid suspicion. I memorized the office dynamics so I could anticipate attacks. And slowly, I transformed from a target into a patient observer, silently counting the days until I could strike back. Then came the day I dreaded the most. Rachel called me into her office. The door clicked behind me, and I tried to mask the panic rising in my chest. "It's not working out," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You're just not a good fit for the company culture." I was stunned. My world shrank into that phrase. No one laughed. As I stepped outside, I felt lighter than I had in years. But the story didn't end there. Because consequences don't stop at office doors. Rachel's reputation followed her. Quietly at first. Then loudly. References were withdrawn. Offers disappeared. People talked. The industry is smaller than it pretends to be. And people remember. Months later, I heard she'd taken a lower position at another firm. No team. No authority. No power. Just silence. The same silence she once forced me into. Only this time, it wasn't strategic. It was permanent. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I moved on. But I never forgot. Because what I learned in that office changed me forever. Silence isn't weakness. It's observation. It's patience. It's preparation. And when used correctly, it becomes something far more dangerous than words. It becomes control. People think revenge ends with justice. They imagine a clean line between pain and relief, as if exposing the truth automatically erases everything that came before it. I believed that too, at least, I wanted to. But the truth is, when the noise finally stops, the silence that follows is louder than anything you've ever endured. My new job was everything the old one wasn't. Calm. Structured. Respectful. No raised voices. No sarcasm disguised as humor. No fear hanging in the air like static before a storm. On paper, I had one. And yet, every morning, I still woke up bracing myself. I caught myself rehearsing conversations that never happened. Flinching when someone laughed too loudly behind me. Double-checking emails before sending them, terrified that a harmless sentence might somehow be twisted against me. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the source is gone. It rewires you. At work, my new colleagues praised my efficiency, my attention to detail, my calm demeanor under pressure. They called me reliable, grounded, easy to work with. What they didn't know was that those traits were born from survival. Late at night, memories from the old office resurfaced without warning. Rachel's voice, sharp, dismissive. Sarah's laughter. Alex's smirk. Moments I thought I'd forgotten replayed themselves in vivid detail, like my mind was refusing to let them go. I realized something unsettling. Part of me was still there. Still sitting behind that front desk. Still pretending not to hear. Still counting insults instead of minutes. And that frightened me. I began to question myself. Had staying silent really been strength, or had it been fear disguised as patience? Had I endured too much for too long? Should I have spoken sooner? These questions didn't come with answers. They came with weight. The world around me had moved on, but my body hadn't caught up yet. Then, one evening, I received an email. No subject line. No greeting. Just a name I hadn't seen in months, Rachel. My hands shook as I opened it. The message was short. No accusations. No apologies either. I didn't realize how far I'd gone. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I'm paying for it. That was it. No explanation of what paying for it meant. No justification. No attempt to soften what she'd done. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. For the first time, I understood something deeply uncomfortable. Closure doesn't always arrive wrapped in satisfaction. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, leaving you to decide what to do with it. I never replied. Not because she didn't deserve an answer, but because I didn't owe her one. Over the following months, I heard fragments of what had happened after I left. Rachel struggled to hold a position for long. Teams didn't trust her. People remembered. Sarah and Alex had their own reputations to manage, and neither of them landed where they'd hoped. Their downfall wasn't dramatic. It was slow. Unremarkable. Lonely. And that, somehow, felt more fitting than any public humiliation ever could. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened to me. People began seeking me out. Not for gossip. Not for revenge stories. For guidance. A former coworker reached out, saying she'd finally left a toxic job after hearing what I'd done. Another thanked me for proving that documenting abuse mattered. A junior employee from my new company quietly asked how to handle a manager who made her feel small. I realized my silence had turned into something else. Influence. I began speaking, carefully, intentionally. Not loudly. Not angrily. But clearly. I set boundaries early. I addressed issues when they arose. I didn't wait for cruelty to escalate before naming it. The fear that once kept me quiet became a warning system instead. And slowly, something inside me shifted. I stopped replaying old conversations. I stopped anticipating attacks. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I hadn't just survived that office. I had learned from it. One day, while cleaning out an old folder on my phone, I came across the recordings. The notes. The evidence that had once felt like my lifeline. I hesitated. Then I deleted them. Not because they didn't matter. But because I no longer needed them. Letting go wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about trusting myself to recognize danger without collecting proof of pain again. The silence that once protected me had served its purpose. Now, I didn't need it the same way. I could speak. I could choose when to stay quiet, and when not to. And that choice made all the difference. For a long time, I believed the story ended the moment I walked out of that office for the last time. I thought victory looked like justice served, names exposed, reputations ruined. I thought it would feel loud, triumphant, undeniable, satisfying in the way movies make revenge look. But real life rarely offers clean endings. Real endings are quieter. Years passed. Not in dramatic leaps, but in ordinary moments. Morning commutes. Work deadlines. Conversations that didn't leave me drained. I built a life that felt stable, grounded in ways I hadn't known I needed. I grew into roles that demanded confidence, not compliance. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped thinking of myself as someone who had been wronged. I became someone who had survived. There were moments, though, when the past resurfaced unexpectedly. A tone of voice that sounded too familiar. A joke that went a step too far. In those moments, my body remembered before my mind did. My breath would hitch. My shoulders would tense. But this time, I didn't disappear. I spoke. Not harshly. Not emotionally. Just clearly. And each time I did, the fear loosened its grip a little more. I began to understand something that took me years to articulate. The most damaging part of that job wasn't the insults or the humiliation. It was how it taught me to doubt my own perception. To question whether what I felt was bad enough to matter. To believe that silence was the price of belonging. That belief had almost stayed with me forever. Almost. One afternoon, during a team meeting at my new company, a junior employee hesitated before speaking. I recognized the look immediately, the careful calculation, the fear of saying the wrong thing. It was a look I used to wear every day. I waited. Then I said, calmly, "Go ahead. We're listening." She spoke. Her idea was strong. The room responded positively. Later, she thanked me. She didn't know why it mattered so much. But I did. That was when I realized the story hadn't ended, it had evolved. What happened to me didn't just change my career. It changed how I showed up in the world. It sharpened my awareness of power, of silence, of the invisible lines people draw around others without permission. And it gave me a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but accepted anyway. To notice. To interrupt. To make space. I never became loud. I never became confrontational. That was never who I was. But I became unignorable. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret staying silent for so long. I tell them no. Because silence was the language I needed at the time. It allowed me to observe. To understand. To survive. It wasn't weakness, it was adaptation. But I also tell them this. Silence is a tool, not a home. You can use it. You can set it down. You can choose when to speak. That choice is power. I don't know where Rachel is now. I don't follow her career. I don't wonder if she's changed. That chapter closed itself the moment I stopped needing answers from her. The same goes for Sarah and Alex. They no longer live in my thoughts. And that, more than anything, feels like freedom. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes, it looks like growth so complete that the people who hurt you become irrelevant. I stayed silent at work. But I was never powerless. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes, it looks like growth so complete that the people who hurt you become irrelevant. I stayed silent at work. But I was never powerless. I was listening. I was learning. I was preparing. And when the moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I simply refused to stay quiet any longer. That was my victory. Not because they fell, but because I rose. And if this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the quiet one, the one who endured in silence, the one who was underestimated, then this story was for you. Stories like this matter because they remind us that strength isn't always loud. If this meant something to you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. You never know who's listening quietly, waiting for a story like this to remind them they're not alone.